Hey everybody, Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share my full review, the digitally digested segment for the Sony Cyber-shot DSC-RX10. This is, in my opinion, the best bridge camera on the market, and in many ways one of the best cameras for the general consumer or enthusiast that isn't necessarily looking for professional results. And by professional, I mean full-frame sensors or even smaller sensors in mirrorless cameras like APS-C or Micro Four Thirds. So what are we getting here in this package? Well, it's one body. You're looking at it here. $1299.99 is the retail here in the States, and it's pretty well featured in terms of having just about everything a consumer could want in a travel camera. It isn't going to fit in your pocket, so it isn't like its sibling, the RX100 or RX100 Mark II in that regard, but it gives you a much greater focal range. You're talking about a lens that basically takes what's built into the RX100 and RX100 Mark II, which is granted a very good Carl Zeiss piece of glass at f1.8, and simply destroys it because we've got a constant f2.8 on this lens, but the reach is just astounding. I mean, you go out to 200 millimeters on this, and you actually can get pleasing wide-angle results from it too. So a completely different tool than a pocketable Cyber-shot, even though it does wear the Cyber-shot name. It is a member of the RX family, which inherently means that it's basically the best and brightest of Sony's Cyber-shot existence. So under the hood, we have the exact same sensor as the RX100 Mark II, which leads a lot of people to think, why not just buy that camera? And well, it's the reason I just mentioned. You don't have a lot more features that I haven't even begun to touch on that you do have here with the RX10, but the key one is really the glass. You are able to fit the RX 100 and 100 Mark II in your pocket, but you don't have the lens, you don't have the viewfinder. You do have the multi-interface shoe on the Mark II, as well as I mentioned, an identical sensor to the one that's in here, literally a one-for-one of the 20 megapixel 1-inch sensor, which is really Sony's sweet spot at this point. I mean, the 20 megapixel sensor that's in this camera and the RX100 Mark II is likely the same one being employed now in their brand new 4K camcorder. This 1-inch sensor is a gem. It performs incredibly well. It's versatile. When it comes to the still side of the results you're going to get out of this camera, much like the RX100 Mark II before it, it really will challenge many people in terms of wondering whether or not you shot that photo that you're looking at and saying, wow, it's a great still, with a digital SLR or a point and shoot like we're looking at here. And granted, this is a very beefy point and shoot because even though it's a point and shoot camera, it weighs almost as much as many of those mirrorless interchangeable lens options. But the argument there is also moot because much like the one I was mentioning earlier about, is the RX 100 Mark II a far less expensive way to get similar results? It's not. It is in terms of the sensor, but the difference in feature set is just, they're night and day. You're not comparing like cameras. So that's a false equivalency, one that needs to be thrown away. The interchangeable lens one, on the other hand, is a legitimate question, and I've addressed that in comparing this camera to the full-frame A7. And, in terms of mirrorless options, that's the best comparison, really. And I think that's where the line is blurred because the actual output from this camera, when we talk about stills and in terms of video, it outclasses even the full-frame A7, A7R, even when paired with great glass. And that's to do with the 5K direct readout sampling from the sensor that is employed in video capture. Another great feature and part of what's modern about the RX10 that isn't necessarily on a lot of Sony's cameras. They have cut some corners, but again, comparing it to something that's mirrorless, or Micro Four Thirds, I should say as well, even though you'll have a larger physical sensor, you won't have this basically, almost prime, that constant f2.8 across such a giant range. And if we were to compare this to full frame, as I already did with the A7, you're talking about something more along the lines of 7 to 9 millimeters out to around 70, 75 millimeters. and that's if we were doing a real light comparison. And the aperture would be somewhere around I think f4.5, f4.4. So you're not going to have that constant. That's what that constant f2.8 equates to in full frame. So almost kit-like performance on full frame, but you're not going to have Zeiss T-Star coating on that full frame kit lens. So hopefully that clarifies a lot of the comparisons people are doing right now on what this or how this camera stacks up to interchangeable lens options. But I think this isn't really about trying to compare this camera to interchangeable lens options. It's really about having one camera that's going to go with you in travel and is going to do everything well. Again, it's not going to deliver professional quality output, but it's going to get very close to all of its mirrorless interchangeable lens competition. And that's why, as I mentioned, it is the best reference point for this bridge camera, because there is no other bridge camera that challenges the RX10 presently. So with that long story, my long-winded, at least true impressions of this camera thus far, and really just the beginning of this video in terms of full impressions, let's take a look at the body itself, and then we'll get into menus and eventually, the conclusion. In terms of the left side, you've seen throughout the course of the handling of this camera in this video, we've got some Zeiss branding on the lens. The lens also has a direct control of the aperture, which is great. Being able to go from f2.8 all the way to 16 on the fly, which, by the way, I have in silent mode now, but there's a switch on the bottom that allows you, and I've shown this before, to turn that silence on and off. In other words, you can actually create the physical click that's found on the RX1, which I also own, which is a great camera, but doesn't have this option. So now we've got the click mode on, and you'll hear it right now. Or at least let me get it closer to the microphone so you have a better chance. And I think you'll have heard that through my mic. And basically, that's going to allow someone who actually knows where they're at in their stops to shoot on the fly and make changes without actually having to view the ring, the aperture ring. So that's the beauty there. So controls that ultimately, in many ways, best a lot of interchangeable lens camera options, because lenses simply don't have this necessarily built on. So that's one advantage already beyond the obvious f2.8 and Zeiss T-Star blessing. But the sensor combination with this is superb, and that's what all of the RX cameras get right. Weather sealing across the board, and that's, as I mentioned, where I was starting before here, the left side of the camera. You can see the beginning of that. We've got our input as well as output for audio. So you can see a red microphone jack and green headphone jack for monitoring. And while this may seem like nothing special, Sony used to reserve this for their best-in-class products, and then started to build it out into some less expensive cameras, and now they've reversed order again. We're back to seeing it only in best-of-class products, but the multi-interface shoe renders the audio input and output useless if you're really a pro seeking next level quality. In terms of connectivity, we have Sony's multi-port right there, and next to it is a micro HDMI out, which will give you a clean HDMI out. For those of you wondering what the utility of that, it allows you to actually professionally grade your video. This is something that essentially cameras before this, you weren't going to get that sort of capability out of the box on, especially a Cyber-shot, a point and shoot. That just, it doesn't seem like it would be something a Cyber-shot enthusiast or owner would really want. But Sony realizes that there's a gray space in this camera market of people who continuously buy interchangeable lens cameras in the hopes that they're going to find the perfect camera without actually ever advancing their photographic knowledge. And what that results in is really just a lot of waste, which isn't bad for the camera company, but Sony seems to at least be one of the savvy ones with regard to recognizing that deficiency in terms of a product filling that void, and that's the RX10, folks. In terms of the top of the body, it looks almost exactly like an Alpha A-mount camera, and whether we're talking about the A77, I mean any of the older models, it looks exactly like them. But it does take on some of the features of the RX family, like the cable shutter release there. The on-off switch is all its own. That's not something that you see on other RX family members. The zoom toggle, relatively smooth on this camera. When you're in video, it is locked. That's something that you should be aware of. And it does zoom slowly in order to give you a very professional result. And when I say professional, I mean even. That's what Sony is considering a professional result, rather than something that's jerky and pulling around and making the audience nauseous. And you can clearly switch off the click noise so that you can on the fly change your actual focus essentially in video through aperture and defocus background, which is just a great thing if you're an amateur or a true videographer. I mean, this is a great B or even C camera for anyone shooting weddings. That's where this camera just has a whole other life that regular bridge camera consumers are not even thinking about. But away from that, traditional mode dial on the left, again borrowed straight from Sony's A-mount basically, and standard fare here from, I mean, everything that's there, nothing new. 2 programmable modes and video panorama and everything else you already knew was coming. Microphones flank the multi-interface shoe, which will let you throw on things like an external mic. You can even jump up to Sony's $800 XLR option if you really need that pro quality level. It's there. You also have a lot of different flash options. In terms of other things, sky is really the limit. I mean, it's one of those areas where for all the people who say I don't care about the multi-interface shoe, having it means the world to the person next to you who does care about being able to do more with their camera. So this is on a camera that's in the level or the quality that the RX10 resides at $1,300, at the very least just in pricing, but it actually does back it up in performance. The multi-interface shoe has to be there. I mean, after all, it's on cameras like the HX50V in the Cyber-shot world. You can see right here, again, those are the microphones that flank it. Audio quality is very good, almost too sensitive. You're going to have to turn that gain down because otherwise it's going to probably pick you up breathing, and that's, if you're not using an external microphone option. The flash is right here, and you can pop that out with this button. I'm going to power the camera on for those of you that have been waiting, but those of you who actually follow my channel know my style of review and are not in any way shocked by the way things have been going here. And it's a great camera, so if you're here, you've come to the right place. This is going to get the praise it deserves. It does have some shortcomings, though, and I won't leave those out. The flash is one of them. It's decent. I mean, it's a built-in flash. You can't have incredibly high expectations for it. In terms of its overall design, you force it back in. It's got that little lever going on. It works. In terms of its actual range, it's limited like any point-and-shoot, especially Cyber-shot camera. At least it does not have interference from the barrel, which is something if you're an NEX owner or now Alpha owner, a lot of the larger lenses do interfere with the built-in flash. That has been an issue in the past, especially with the SEL18-200. So that's something to know. At least the engineering is done right here. You do benefit and get an LCD readout on the top, another feature that is reminiscent of being in the Alpha brand of cameras rather than the Cyber-shot, even though this is an RX. And you can see we've got essentially where we're at in terms of our aperture, as well as battery readout. It also gives you the number of shots that you have in terms of the capacity of your SD card. I don't presently have one in there. That's why you see that right there blinking. It would populate a number. And then it tells you, your white balance settings. And it's just good to have a readout. You also have a backlight button there, so you can actually bring up the glow if lighting conditions require, as well as your focus control. And also just a whole host of different things, your drive mode. There are things that will populate on this menu and be useful to you on the fly. Again, promoting the fact that this is clearly for enthusiasts, not for casual shooters. But the flip side is that in many ways this is the perfect camera for casual shooters as well, because the results are really good out of camera. If you're shooting in JPEG, extra fine, forget about RAW capability. Even though it's here, I kind of feel like Sony's done a beautiful job with the Bionz X processor, and just the JPEG engine here is awesome. I mean, the output is great, and I would see why someone would pick this up and not care about using RAW even though it's there. I mean, this isn't a full frame or Micro Four Thirds or APS-C class sensor. 1 inches does afford you a lot more than anything else in the point-and-shoot range, which is why the RX100 and Mark II are incredibly popular, and that's why the RX10 should be as well, with this fantastic lens. Built-in neutral density filter also I haven't mentioned, which is just another great thing that, you know, show me one. It just, this pairing, all of the elements, build quality, that weather sealing, Carl Zeiss, it isn't just, you know, branding, it really does legitimately come through. Check out my video sample with the icicles. Really an incredible piece of glass paired with a very solid sensor that in low light won't take on APS-C completely, but it'll get really close. And that's why this $1,300 price point could be a bargain depending on your needs. Exposure compensation, a dedicated dial right here. Sony's been doing this with all of their cameras. And then you've got a programmable, you know, customizable button right there. You also have, as you can see on the back side, and the 3-inch display is solid, pretty much the same as what you're going to find again across most of Sony's cameras. It does articulate, can't flip around to do self-portrait, but none of Sony's cameras can. And this back is definitely a blend. The entire setup, the viewfinder, which just went off for me, covering the detector, the sensor there. That's good old Konica Minolta love for you. But basically, the screen, again, in the same class as everything else. The viewfinder is not, even though it is an OLED, it does have a lower resolution than the NEX or Alpha brethren. Now the A6000, I think, also dropped down, not exactly to the same point. But the back of this camera really does look like a blend of the HX Mega Zoom cameras with an Alpha traditional interchangeable lens Sony APS-C model. So even, you know, where the record button is, just the entire layout. So much like a lot of Sony's cameras as of late, they're really creating a little bit of a Frankenstein, pulling, you know, all of the best features they can, not only in terms of internals, but external design as well, from what has worked. And by worked, I mean has sold well, and what usually sells well is the stuff that performs well. The screen I mentioned does articulate. I will show you that right now. You can see it right there. And, you know, it's a good feature to have. There's no one that's going to say, I'd rather not have that. But, you know, in terms of button layouts, really simple here. Your memory card bay right there. Very sturdy. In fact, I noted in previous videos that it's actually more sturdy than the memory card bay on the far more expensive A7R that I have right here, which is just crazy when you think about it. $2,300 body. Somehow the door on this to get to memory has give, but here we've got something solid, like a rock. The grip, ergonomics, really actually quite nice, and weight distribution is fantastic, which is one of the big advantages to this camera over going with an interchangeable lens option in order to afford similar focal reach, or I should say flexibility. Again, this is not a one-for-one with an APS-C or full frame. I mentioned that at the beginning of the video. You do have Wi-Fi and NFC here, but no access to the Play Memories applications, which is a letdown. I really think that that's one of the big shortcomings of this camera. You can see you can use this focus ring to zoom as well. It's assignable, and it works really well. I mean, very precise. If you see right now, as slow or as you know, basically as fast as you could possibly want, you're going to get that responsiveness. And if you need to have, you know, electronics reproduce the traditional feel, Sony's done a really good job. So 24 to 200 is really an ideal range, I think, for travel. I think this is a perfect complementary camera to something like the RX1 or RX100 because it really fills out the gap of what you're missing. You know, with a camera like the RX100 or Mark II, or even the full frame 1 or 1R, you just don't have the rest of these features. You don't have that built-in viewfinder. You may not even have the multi-interface. You certainly don't have an info readout. In terms of customization, the RX1 is actually quite amazing for its actual form factor, and this pulls off that same feat. NFC and Wi-Fi really just, even though they don't have access to the Play Memories application store, you can pair this up with a phone and control this camera almost relatively in a full-featured fashion using a phone, which is just a fantastic feature that Sony has been touting with all of their recent high-end, as well as a lot of the, I will say, just in general, recent offerings in both Cyber-shot and Alpha lineups, because it just makes sense. Everyone has smartphones, everyone has a tablet or a phone that works with either iOS or Android at the very least, and Sony's got an application store. In this case, again, only smart remote control. I did also share a video about how you can use an application for Android to do time lapse. It'll only basically use the smart remote control app in order to take a group of stills, which you can control the parameters for, but that's still better than having no option. And I would love to see something like time lapse, and I think it really doesn't make sense that Sony didn't integrate Play Memories into a camera like this. You can see it retracting there. That's the power save feature powering down. I'm going to take you into the menus in a moment, but this should round out everything that you really need to know about this camera in terms of overall use. The buttons that I went over, the battery I did not. Let me go ahead and flip it over and show you that before we get to the balance, and I just powered it on accidentally. Is the battery type is the W type. Let me power it down before I just strip it. I don't want to make the camera too crazy here. And the W type is the same battery that Sony's been using now for quite a while in the NEX lineup of cameras, as well as a lot of the Cyber-shot HX models that I've reviewed in the past. And it's a tried and true performer, and it does really well. This camera is able to pull off a full, I would say, around 40 minutes of video, even though it's broken up into 29-minute clips on a single charge. These batteries are not expensive, at least anymore. You can find them for a lot less than they retailed when they first launched. That doesn't mean they're cheap by any means, but definitely attainable. And in terms of stills, more importantly, since this is a still camera first, you're looking at roughly 400 shots easily. Granted, when you use some of those modes that are, the auto intelligence stuff, where, it's taking several exposures, or you're doing HDR stuff, it's not going to be the exact same performance, but it all depends how you push the camera, what you're doing with the LCD. Are you using any other features? How much Wi-Fi transferring are you doing? All different things will take a toll. But with that out of the way, and with the full tour of the body, and the entire overview of build quality, which again I will reiterate, it's a combo of plastic and metallics, but it's just, you can feel it in the weight, and that's a good thing. You would not want a bridge camera at this price point with this sort of capability that didn't have some heft for both balance and also just to remind you that you aren't shooting with a toy. And that's not to say that I in any way want to carry around a brick, but the RX10 is as far from a brick as I've ever used. This is one of the actually most enjoyable cameras to shoot with that I've ever handled. Doesn't mean it's right for me, which is I'll be getting to in my conclusion, but I think it is right for many of you. So in terms of the actual menu, you have the benefit of Sony's wisdom here as of late to shift away from consumer gimmicky menus that look like they're meant for smartphones that we dealt with in many of their NEX cameras and Cyber-shot cameras, of course, towards their traditional alpha menus that are straight-laced camera enthusiast pages of features. And that's exactly how they should look, frankly. And that's where we're going to go right now. Let me power the camera on. And by the way, autofocus on here really fast. I'm going to get around to talking about, the A6000 for those of you that really are curious about whether or not that's what you should be picking up. But I think I have already answered that question by covering the fact that anyone who compares this to an interchangeable lens camera has to remember, in order to accomplish what this lens can do, you better be ready to spend at least $1,000 on glass, especially if you're going with Sony options. So let's jump into that menu. I'm actually going to bring this shot in tight because there's no reason for it not to be. And let's go ahead for it. Let's menu dive here. So right now I'm in settings. I'm going to start at the beginning, though, for the sake of uniformity here, and make myself comfortable in turn. Get ready for this, because we are already at 25 minutes here, for those of you that have made it this far. First and foremost, image size. So 20 megapixels, that's the native resolution of this sensor. That's what I recommend you stick with, but of course, if you want to drop it down, you can. Aspect ratio, as usual, you can play with it, but there's actually quite a bit of play here in the RX10, which is unique. You won't find that with a lot of other cameras out there. In terms of picture quality, you can see right now I have it set to fine. I did recommend, as earlier, go with extra fine if you already own the camera. I recommend that over the RAW and JPEG simply because when you shoot in that mode, you better plan on actually using that RAW image. The JPEG you're getting there simply won't look as good as the extra fine. It will not be a tremendous difference, but it's enough for me to recommend that if you have no interest in post-processing, leave the post-processing to the camera itself and stay on extra fine. In terms of panoramic size, essentially you can control that. And that's good, as well as the direction, whether you're sweeping left to right or right to left. Page 2, we've got file format for video recording. As I mentioned, this camera is a stunner when it comes to video. Even though AVC HD is a little bit old at this point, and MP4 is pretty much trash in my opinion, but it's designed for sharing, and that's what it should be respected as. I would still always shoot in AVC HD, but there are those of you I know that still use MP4 just for the file size. And I get that, but if you want to actually get the best performance, you're looking at it here. 60p, 1080p is what you're going to want to go with. Sony refers to that as the PS mode, and then anything below is just a drop off. You know, if you go, and the numbers for those of you unfamiliar is the basically the data rate that's being captured. So lower numbers equals less information captured in those video frames. And I'm not going to get into the argument with people who would say, well, 30p is better, you know, and I'm not going to begin that. More is more in this case, because you can always downsample. That is my motto when it comes to video, especially on a camera like this that just shoots so incredibly clean compared to the competition. No artifacts, virtually none, and autofocus is stellar. Let's go ahead and jump back. In terms of drive mode, of course, the usual options. Bracketing. Flash mode. Of course, you can turn it off, auto, fill, slow sync, rear, wireless, another option. And by the way, that multi-port that's used for charging above the HDMI port also can be used for things like remote controls. That's why it has the multi designation. Beyond that, red eye reduction, you can of course toggle that on and off. Your focus area. Now, that cannot be manipulated in our present setting. I'll go ahead and just switch that so that becomes a moot point. And now let's jump right back into the menu. And you can see, of course, that is manipulatable right now. If that was a word. Make myself laugh there. That's what happens. You get a little loopy when you get 28 minutes into RX10 love here. But yeah, so focus area, of course, you can play around with that. Go with the focus spot. Autofocus illuminator, tend to keep that off when you're dealing with, you know, trying to shoot any kind of pet, animal, or children for that matter. And it annoys people in many instances, but it is effective, so it is one of those compromises we all have to live with. ISO range, so I have this set to auto, but the camera has a pretty decent range. And you're seeing it right here. You can take it pretty high, but keep in mind that once you pass 3200, things are going to look pretty bad. So even though 12.8 is where we hit the wall, 12.8 is not recommended by at least me. So I think 3200 is where most of your auto shots are going to end up hitting, and there's a reason. Going beyond that, you're really pushing this camera a little too far. And that's not to say it can't handle it. It's just a matter of what you're willing to accept. You know, how large a print do you plan to make would be my question. The neutral density filter, of course, easy to leave it to auto, but when you know you need it, throw it on. Great feature to have built in. And really, this is something that did exist in the past on the HX200V. And that's where I say these cameras from Sony lately are literally Frankensteins in a good way. We're getting features from all different models of the past to just create, incredible new offerings. And that's what we have right here. Let me go ahead and jump back. Went too far back. Metering mode, of course. Your white balance, again, it does a pretty solid job on auto, but of course you can go ahead and go through a variety of presets. And they work well. You can actually control the color temperature if you choose. Throw in some custom settings. Dynamic range and HDR. Also want to comment on defocused backgrounds. People want that digital SLR look. They want that shallow depth of field that you can pull off with full frame. You can also pull it off with APS-C. They want those sort of results, and you can do it with this camera. That's the good news. It won't necessarily be as impressive, but I have to say that most of the time that at least the images I've shot with this that I've shown to people, they would have no idea that it came out of a bridge style point and shoot camera. They really think that I'm shooting with another one of my pro quality cameras, and that's not to say the RX10 isn't a pro quality camera in its own right in terms of what it sets out to deliver. Creative style, well, this is a matter of whether or not you actually want to use it, but you have your options here, and they are useful, no question about it. And essentially, you can play with exposure there, and again, just some presets. Picture effect, this is literally Instagram in a camera, and this is not a new thing that Sony has been doing, and it'll just, everything that it suggests here, it shall do. These I don't really use, but I know a lot of people love them, and that's why Sony keeps incorporating them into camera after camera. The focus magnifier, I don't have it on here because we're not in the correct setting, but it does exactly that. It'll literally magnify the point of focus so that you can be sure you're locked on the area you want. And it works. That's important. Unfortunately, a lot of these things often advertised don't end up actually working the way they should. Continuing on. Long exposure noise reduction, of course, you can turn that on or off. I recommend that you, for the regular point and shoot people, I would keep it on, no reason not to. The high ISO noise reduction, now you've got levels. You have normal, low, and off, and that's all about intensity. Basically, best to keep it off, but if that's, I would say, only good if you're shooting raw. If you're relying on the JPEG, play around with normal or low to see what you end up being comfortable with. Lock on autofocus, and this is, basically your ability to track there, which is a good thing. Smile and face detection, which many people think is a gimmick, but I have to tell you, it works. It really does. And if I had anything in front of me with human faces, aka a photo, the irony of this situation, right? I would show you. Let's see if this works. I've got the box with the remote right there. Let's see. I will articulate the screen. We're going to actually use this display to its full capability, and let's see right now if somehow the RX10 is able to detect this child's face. I don't think it's going to pick it up, but you never know. Oh, I think I didn't turn it on. Look at this. How bonehead move that was. Well, either way, no, it is on, so it just couldn't pick it up. Too small a photo with my self-deprecation there. But moving on, smile and face detection does work, and it works well. Soft skin effect, I keep that off. Auto object framing, I mean, it's a horrible feature in my opinion. I mean, it's something where Sony incorporated it because they felt that if you're not familiar with what it does, it literally will reframe your picture. It retains the original, but it tries to figure out what you were framing for you, and in most cases, it's not right. Beyond that, Auto mode, scene selection, movie, those are whited out because of the mode we're in. Steady shot. Now, the stabilization on here is really solid. You also have active steady shot. If you're going for best image quality, you're going to want to shut both of these off, but make sure you are on a tripod because otherwise you're not going to get results you'll be pleased with. It's as simple as that. The color space, you can select between sRGB and Adobe RGB. sRGB is pretty much the standard for general consumption. Adobe RGB is becoming more and more widely accepted. If you have a color accurate display, then likely I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, and that's because your display probably has presets for both color spaces. In terms of the shutter, you can turn that on and off. In terms of auto slow, audio recording, you can turn that on and off as well. Your levels, we're not in the movie mode here, but you can adjust those on the fly. And you need to, as I mentioned before, plan on turning it down because it's far too sensitive. I guess it's that attempt to really give you that pro feel, but it's just too much. The audio out timing, you can also play with that. Wind noise reduction, which you should really only use if you really need to. Memory, because you can actually program, which is a good thing. And you can see we have 2. Go ahead and take a step back. And now we're finally getting into some settings. So zebras here, something that a lot of enthusiasts will be happy to see that was not available on any camera really like this in the past, for the most part, not every. Manual focus assist, your focus magnification time. I was talking about that before with the focus magnification tool. The grid line, I mean, just video features coming in. Audio level display, if you want that on your display, you can. Auto review timing, your display button, your peaking levels. This camera does have peaking functionality as well. Exposure set guide, live view display. Turn that on and off for those of you that don't want it and are going to strictly stick to the OLED. Your pre-autofocus, now that is where the camera will try to constantly autofocus before you've even set the shot up. That can benefit you, in many ways, but it'll also eat battery. So that's really a matter of usage type. Your zoom setting. Now, here you've got the option between optical only, which is where you're going to get the best performance, clear image, which is Sony's own proprietary, basically digital zoom. It crops the image, or you can even extend that more with the literal digital zoom. You've got the ability to switch on the finder or monitor, whether you want to stick with the OLED or the external screen that we're looking at right now. And look, everything is here, and that's what really makes this camera so compelling, is that it really does bring every feature a pro could want, despite the fact that it is not a professional, or at least aimed at pros, being a Cyber-shot. But then again, neither was the RX1 or RX1R or the RX100 or Mark II, but Sony knew that pros were going to be the first to flock towards cameras that set new standards for their form factor. And the RX10 does that too, because it takes the bridge camera market, which was arguably worthless at this point, at least to me, and I think most consumers, and brings it to life. I mean, it just gives it an injection that it has been missing for a long, long time. Your right date, control of the actual zoom function on the ring that I mentioned before. You can switch between standard and step. Again, another, lending it towards its being, a professional feel. And that's what's really cool about this camera, is that it doesn't leave you hitting a wall. This is something you can start out with fresh or grow with, which is why I like it so much. Dial wheel lock, and then we're in wireless settings. You can send to a smartphone, a computer, view on a TV. Of course, you will have to set that up, but it's a painless process, to say the least. It's just sharing some codes across the devices so that they mate. The control with smartphone is a great feature that allows you to shoot videos and stills, frame, control the camera. Very cool. Something that, if this camera wasn't such a great camera, wouldn't be as cool, clearly. So that's something that is noteworthy. your access point setup, all of that good stuff here. I'm going to skip past that. Playback, display rotation, because it will actually, or the orientation will auto-correct itself, even though it didn't right there because I didn't do a full turn. And then 4K still images, because with that raw HDMI output, you do get 4K output for those of you that are curious. And then internal settings. We've got monitor brightness. This is where I talk about, what you can do to the battery. This is where it all becomes tangible. Your viewfinder brightness, your actual finder color temperature, the volume settings, audio signals, that beep, which is always annoying, so that's always off for me at least. Title menu, display quality. I mean, these are all things that just really amount to battery life for the most part, and personal preference. Your HDMI out resolution, your control for HDMI, the info on the display, your USB connection, language, date, time, setup, format, your actual card that would be on board. I don't have one now, so no need to format. And that's it. I think we took it through everything, didn't we? Yep, last page was right here, the version and the settings. And here's the version, at least as of my final review of the RX10 here, the digitally digested segment, version 1. And that's something I also want to point out. Let's hope that Sony does actually update the software on this camera. That's not something they're known to do with Cyber-shot cameras. But this is the sort of camera, if there ever was a Cyber-shot to update, this would be it. And I still have to continue to say that I wish Sony would incorporate play memories. Now, in terms of downsides, because I've given the camera a lot of praise over 40 minutes already, even though I have mentioned some of its limitations, when it comes to still output, you're never going to really approach full frame, or in many ways APS-C, and that's simply because of the limitations of the sensor size itself. And I'll bring out a wider shot here to include some other cameras. If we're talking about something like the A7 or A7R, in this case it is the R, which is just in terms of resolution a beast, and just forget about comparing these two, and that's why I compared this to the A7 and not the R, as well as the NEX6, which is basically the A6000 at this point, the successor. This is a compromise. As I mentioned before, any mirrorless or any interchangeable, I should say, option where you're going to try to do everything this camera can do will end up being inherently more expensive. You will be spending basically the price of this entire camera just on glass, which this is a very good example. This 18 to 200 power zoom lens for the E-mount is a $1,200 piece of glass. So literally just about the cost of the RX10 in itself. And it doesn't have a constant f2.8. It does have great image quality for its size. It is very, very large. And when you have it on a body like the A7, A7R, or any smaller Sony mirrorless cameras that are E-mount based, whether we're talking about NEX or alphas like the A5000 or 6000, you just have a terribly balanced piece of equipment. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't work great. I mean, it's a fantastic performer. In my travels, it's basically one of my go-tos. I love pairing this lens in the past with NEX bodies. Now I am using it on the 7R, where I get 15 megapixel stills in crop mode. But until I get a full frame zoom FE lens, this will work. The whole point is that there's really no place for comparison with interchangeable lens, simply because in order to achieve the actual quality you're going to get from this lens and sensor pairing, you would have to spend, as I've mentioned over and over again, at least $1,000 on whatever lens you plan to buy. And that lens would not give you the zoom range that this does. In full frame equivalency, again, closer to something like the Zeiss Zoom that I'll soon be reviewing, the FE lens, the 24 to 70, even though this would technically be wider on a full frame, this actual focal range when we take sensor size into account. But even then, of course, the full frame camera with that full frame Zeiss lens is going to essentially kill this camera. Not necessarily when it comes to video. That's something where still It seems like Sony has optimized video performance in the RX10 with that whole 5K direct pixel readout of the actual sensor. And again, that is the sensor that's the backbone of their camcorder lineup. So that tells you what you need to know about video camera quality. They're just bumping up the codec in the 4K camera and bit rate so that you have a lot more quality than you're limited to here, because they don't want cannibalization of product line. In fact, the RX10 in many ways, I think, does cannibalize a lot of the lower to mid-tier interchangeable alpha cameras, which I think Sony's aware of, and that's why they made it as expensive as they did. So hopefully this has helped all of you. I mean, great battery life, great image quality, video quality is superb. In fact, better than most cameras, including this $2,300 body with $1,200 lens sitting right here. But even with all of that said, it isn't the perfect camera, the RX10 that is, for every consumer. It's very expensive. It isn't light by any means. But if you want to travel light in terms of having one camera that really is going to do much more than a pocket camera, this is the king. I mean, there is no other bridge camera to compare this to. There used to be better bridge camera offerings than anything Sony made, but now, since the RX10's launch, you just aren't going to find a better bridge. And whether we're talking about the OLED viewfinder, it's still best in class, even with the lower dot count than something like the NEX6. And in terms of the versatility with the multi-interface shoe, not an incredible amount of programmable buttons, but enough that will definitely please anyone who's actually interested in this class of camera. So the RX brand, all about satisfying pairing a great sensor with a great lens. They've done it here again. The body's weather sealed, true 4K output, true raw HDMI output, I should also add, and just really a fantastic package. It's, as I mentioned earlier, incredibly fun to shoot with, and that's because it does everything so well, especially just in auto mode. So many cameras, that people purchase that are interchangeable, lens-based ones, they struggle because they stay in auto and they don't grow. This camera is the perfect answer to that, and Sony recognized that. They realized there was a camera out there that could appeal to both the average consumer looking for best-in-class performance as well as the pro looking for best-in-class performance for actual size. Remember, this is fitting in my palm. This is not going to. The lens barely fits in my palm. Forget about the fact that the camera falls over. This is one of the most uneven, balanced packages you could ever possibly have. But then again, it does still deliver, that is that 18-200 lens, an experience you can't get with another manufacturer. So the bottom line here is that the camera has incredible still and video capability. It is not going to take you up to the same quality as an interchangeable lens system that I would say has APS-C or larger sensor quality. But, as I've mentioned over and over again, the lenses you're going to need to buy will blow away this $1,300 price point, and you're not going to get a lot of the things that do come with this that I've gone over through the course of this video, like the built-in neutral density filter, the T-Star coated lens, which goes beyond just the f2.8 stuff, because that you do pay for that coating. And again, build quality. This is something that more and more we see corners cut. A lot of people feel that corners were cut with the OLED viewfinder going down in dot count, but if that was where the corner was cut, great corner to cut, because the performance is pretty much the same from what I can tell. I haven't seen a real drop-off. And in terms of recording the zoom, it does happen. You can play with the gain to negate that or offset it. But if you do want any audio to really be captured without picking up the zoom, you will need to end up using the multi-interface shoe or some form of external audio with the input for the microphone there. So that's another thing you should know, videographers. It will record its own zoom motor, and that's not that far outside of reality for a camera like this, because generally speaking, anything with a power zoom is going to get picked up, especially when the microphones are mounted right there on the top above the entire assembly of everything that's going on. But great manual feel from a pretty much fully automatic camera that allows you to go in either direction. Solid OLED viewfinder, good information readout at the top, and just ergonomics are really comfortable. The battery life, again, could have been a disappointment, but isn't. No overheating with this camera that I saw in shooting stills or video, for those of you curious, and it's really a winner. So if you're wondering whether or not it's worth the $1,300, it is, but that's if you're not willing to go down the road of spending thousands on an interchangeable lens system, which I think also isn't just about the expense, but also inconvenience and practicality. You know, when you're traveling, do you want to be carrying 4 lenses or 3 lenses, or do you want to have just this one camera that can do it all? So perfect travel camera, best bridge camera ever made, hands down. And it did leave me, you know, hard pressed with the question of, do I abandon my trusty 18-200 power zoom? Because even though the power zoom here has, you know, quite a bit more range, wide to long, than this lens, there's still something to be said for everything else that comes in this package, and literally the value of the lens is the value of this whole camera. So I've struggled with that for a while. That's part of the reason this video is as long as it is. But for me personally, in my ecosystem of gear, the RX10 at the end of the day isn't right for me, simply because I wouldn't want to give up my 18-200 power zoom as a trade-off for this, and I really would have to, because I feel like they do overlap. That's how close that 1-inch sensor performance is with the optimized glass to at least APS-C performance with this E-mount lens, or even mounted to the 7 or 7R. So I found myself in a position where I really couldn't justify giving up a lens that I really love, which I would have to, because these just too much of an overlap because of the sensor performance, in my opinion. Again, that gap is way too narrow between the 1-inch and the APS-C. And of course, there are people that will swear by sensor size, but at the end of the day, what the real consumer cares about is how those images look coming out of camera. And that's another thing that the RX10 has in its favor, like most RX cameras, except for the full frame ones at least. Without care, this camera will do an incredible job of just automatically taking beautiful shots that will make you feel like you knew something you didn't prior to ownership. The reality is that it's just a very intelligent camera, and that's something Sony's been getting better at every year. But if you go with an interchangeable system, Sony is going to assume that some of that responsibility of making a great shot is going to fall on you, and that's why shooting in auto here isn't going to yield as good results as you will get on the left. Also, autofocus here on the RX10 definitely decisively faster than the A7 or A7R. Of course, not faster than the brand new A6000 that's going to launch, which is the fastest autofocus system, at least right now, that I'm aware of to date. So a lot to like here, but for me personally, unfortunately, it wasn't a fit. I was hoping it would be. In many ways, I thought it was the perfect gap filler for travel. Bring the RX1, the RX10, and the RX100 or Mark II like I have, and you don't need to bring any of the pro-style gear. But the fact of the matter is the A7R is just too amazing for me personally to choose the RX10 for the relative space, as you can see, that they take up right now. Yes, this package on the right is substantially larger, but when it comes to my travel bag, it really isn't. So this is all a matter of personal preference, what you need. Do you want to carry lenses? If you do, you should be getting an interchangeable lens camera. If you don't, you should be getting this. In fact, this is the camera that I would recommend to the majority of people in the market who even think they need interchangeable lenses, but in reality, they really don't. Or at least once they would shoot with this, they'd realize that. So the RX10 is really just a solid performer top to bottom. Again, it's not going to, if you pixel peep, give you the sort of resolution that anything full frame is going to, or even APS-C, but it'll get very, very close to that APS-C and Micro Four Thirds quality. And that's why the $1,300 price point, in my opinion, makes it a bargain when you compare it to any of those cameras in the interchangeable mirrorless business that do end up costing a lot more when adding accessories, glass, all of the things that you need, since a lot of those cameras also don't have viewfinders. So a lot more value in the RX10 that I think anybody really perceives, and that's what part of today's video was all about as well. So there are advantages and disadvantages. I think the advantages for the average consumer are far greater in going with the RX10 than any interchangeable lens camera from any manufacturer, Sony included, unless, of course, you require specific needs that this camera cannot fill. And I've pretty much outlined in this almost hour video, I think, everything that this camera can pull off. In closing, a final thought on this camera is, if you can believe it, a final one, is that really on the keeper ratio, which I know everybody, enthusiast, pro alike, always thinks about when they do put the camera in auto and pass it off to someone, or even if they're shooting on their own and they don't want to be bothered with actually manipulating images, you do have a much higher rate of keepers coming out of the RX10. I was alluding to that earlier when I said, well, the RX1, not so much because it's full frame, which is true. The 10 and the 100 and the Mark II, really just that in itself for many consumers will be the difference in overall happiness with their camera. This, or any other for that matter, is how do those images end up come out? How do they look at the end of the day, and how many of them are good and how many are bad? And with interchangeable lens systems, as I said earlier, it's assumed that you're going to be hands on deck, not in auto and relying on the camera to make every decision for you. So that's where the RX10 will outperform any NEX, any Alpha, in my opinion, especially because now we've got a sensor that, while it isn't up to snuff with stuff like anything with a large sensor, it does blow away anything before it in the traditional Cyber-shot or entire point and shoot arena. And yes, there are cameras coming out now with larger sensors too to compete with the RX10, but they still do not match the feature set, build quality, weatherproofing, everything I've mentioned here. So the 10 will rule for quite a while. This is not just a short-lived moment. In fact, I think until Sony decides to replace it, the 10 is going to keep this position locked up. So if this is a sign of things to come in the future, Sony just continues to impress. So if it wasn't clear already, the RX10 gets a full endorsement from me, despite my reservations and very few critiques. The camera is simply a gem. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. And of course, as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.